Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to compare two of my favorite divers with the new amazingly gorgeous Glacier Marine Master Reduced and the sleeper hit that is the Pepsi Orient Star Diver. Now, realistically, I doubt anyone is trying to decide between these two specific watches, as they are very different styles and sizes, and more importantly, prices. With the JDM specific 43mm Orient Star Diver at around $500 and the 42mm Marine Master Reduced at around $1,000. But at the same time, I thought this could be interesting, as it could give you an idea of what the best of Orient has compared to one of the better Seiko divers out there. And along the same lines, give you an idea of what to expect with other Marine Master Reduce or even Marine Master 200s. Now, it's been a while since I've done any sort of comparison video, and I'm going to change things up a little bit here. But basically, we're going to take an analytical approach to this. We're going to go over 12 different categories, and I'm going to score each watch from 1 to 10 in those categories, with 1 being the worst I've ever seen, 5 being average, and 10 being the best, and everything else being somewhat in between those. Then we'll add all of this up and see if there's a clear winner. That said, let's get to it, and let's first start off with the cases, with an emphasis here being on more design and finish, which is something I think both of these watches excel at in different ways. Comparatively, the Orient Star is not only a larger watch at 43.6mm, but one that's more of a straight tool watch. Looking down, it looks like it's entirely brushed, with no crown guards, beveled edges, or any extra frills for that matter. Yet the bottom of the case, right as it heads towards the case back, actually has a nice polished beveled edge to it, helping to thin out the design from the side, while leaving the case more subtle as you look head on, one where the dial and bezel seem to be the center of focus. The finish of the watch is something I also love. The brushed sides have almost a wood grain-like texture to them, which I think helps that tool watch aesthetic. Yet, despite how they look, they are buttery smooth to the touch. Overall, Orient did a great job here with what's really a minimalist design. Although, when it comes to case design, I think the Marine Masters are hard to beat. Regardless of if you're talking about the Marine Master 300, 200s, or these smaller reduced versions, Seiko did a fantastic job. Compared to the Orient Star, this is a more elegant design, where it has a mixture of brushed and polished surfaces paired with a curvy flow. One that catches both the light and your attention in the various angles and textures of its surface. Normally I'd be concerned with this much polish on the sidewalls of a diver, but here Seiko has also applied their DyeShield anti-scratch resistant coating to help. Since the overall design is inspired by one of Seiko's original divers, you could say that the Marine Master Reduced is a bit retro. Yet the thing is, that original watch also helped define Seiko's design language for decades to come. So while it's definitely retro, it also seems perfectly modern at the same time, at least compared to other Seikos, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Either way, both of these cases are great. Yet I think the Seiko is the clear winner here, as its case has a more intricate and intriguing design. So I'd give the Seiko a 10, while I'd give the Orient Star an 8. Moving on to the bracelets, we have a very similar situation, where the Orient Star is far more straightforward, with an entirely brushed design, and the Seiko is a little more intricate, with the top and bottom of the center link having a polished edge, as well as polished sides. And just like the case, it should have a DyeShield scratch-resistant coating applied. Both of these are a tad rattly, but overall I think they are good bracelets for the price. Both are oyster-style bracelets. Both have solid end links and links secured with a collar and pin system. The only place they really differ is the clasp, as Orient continued to be Orient and used a pressed clasp here, whereas Seiko surprisingly included a milled clasp. Although, at this price, they damn well better, but considering it's a Seiko, it's still surprising to see. So here I think the Seiko easily has the edge, but not necessarily by much. So I'll give the Seiko a 7 while the Orient gets a 6. Since these are divers, let's talk bezels. In terms of materials used, the Orient is much easier to talk about. It's a steel bezel with a brushed Pepsi aluminum insert, and I think this is pretty obvious when you look at it. Whereas with the Seiko, there is a little bit of a discussion here, specifically as to what the insert is actually made of, as it has more of a glossy sheen than your typical brushed aluminum. For the sake of this video, I'm working under the assumption that this is an aluminum insert, just because if you look at other watches like this in their price range, that's typically what you'd expect. It might just be an aluminum insert with a different finish, or maybe that dye shield coating gave it that sheen. So in terms of materials, they're pretty equal. However, the action is a little bit better on one. If you've ever owned a Seiko or an Orient diver, you should know what to expect with these. They all seem to be about the same. Compared to other divers, the action always seems to be a little bit more muted. They aren't exactly the best bezels out there, but they're also definitely not the worst. Between these two, the clicky action of the Seiko is a little more sharp and defined. So with that in mind, I give it a 6, while the Orient gets a 5. Now, with regard to the movement, I'm not really knowledgeable enough about the actual design to get into the full nitty-gritty. So I'm just going to judge this based on specs and features. However, if you are, feel free to comment down below on which movement you think is better. But with regard to the specs, I think they're both pretty equal. The Seiko uses a 6R35, a one-step upgrade over their 4R series, where the Orient is using an F6N47, again one step over their standard F6922 movement. Both still have a standard 21,600 beat rate, and both have an upgraded power reserve. In that way, I think the Seiko has the clear advantage here, with a 70-hour power reserve compared to Orient's 50. But the Orient also has that power reserve indicator. Some like it, some hate it, but regardless, it is an extra feature. And I think overall that does bring balance to the movements. So I think they both get a score of 7. Although one thing that should be pointed out that often gets overlooked with these Orients is that the movement may be a little hard to service. Depending on where you live, you may have a harder time finding someone to work on it, especially since this one is a JDM exclusive. Now, luckily I haven't had to service this one, but when I do, I realize that there's a good chance I'm gonna have to send it back to Japan. So in that way, there is an advantage to the Seiko, but despite that, I think I'm gonna keep both scores as a 7. Alright, so let's move on to the next really big topic, and that's the dials. In here, we're gonna be talking about design and quality. Usability, we'll talk about a little later. And in some ways, this is really going to come down to modern versus retro, with the more modern looking Orient versus the more classically themed Seiko. And honestly, if this was just a standard Marine Master, not the Save the Ocean Glacier version, I think Orient would have a clear advantage here. However, this is the Save the Ocean version, and this glacier texture on the dial is simply amazing. It's a textured dial with these thick, irregular vertical lines running etched into a light blue metallic base, creating what really looks like the side of a glacier. Beyond that though, you have a Marine Master set of indices and a handset that's fairly common with Seiko, at least with Seiko's higher end divers. In fact, I think all 3 of the Save the Ocean Glacier models use the exact same handset. Regardless of how often it's used, as you can see in these macro shots, everything is beautifully done. And I appreciate how no specific element of the dial overpowers any of the others. While the glacier texture is clearly an eye-catching feature, the hands and the indices as well as the subtle black chapter rings still clearly come through. And as a whole, I think there's a terrific balance between all the elements, creating something effective, unique, and eye-catching. Which honestly is something you could also say about the Orient Star, although here it does accomplish that in its own way. Where the Seiko's dial is compact and efficient, the Orient's is wide and expansive, taking full advantage of that larger case. With the Orient, the dial itself is more traditional, using a deep dark sunburst blue, which is then paired with a very unusual set of hands and indices. And now that I think about it, the dial designs here are almost polar opposites of each other, at least in terms of what's unique versus what's traditional. Although no matter what way you look at it, the Orient Star is still very eye-catching. One thing I love is the handset. Now these aren't classically polished as you might expect, but just check out these macro shots. I'm not sure if these are brushed, polished, or maybe even powder coated, but whatever's going on here, they are perfectly uniform, helping everything to come through clearly and distinctly, with not just a contrast in colors, but also textures against the sunburst dial. I honestly love both of these in different ways, and I can honestly stare at the macro shots of both of these for hours. Yet between the two, I think the Seiko barely edges out the Orient here, and I think that's all thanks to the textured dial. So in terms of a score, I give the Glacier Marine Master a 9, while the Orient gets an 8. As for Lume, if you've watched either of these reviews, you know exactly how this is going to turn out, as the Orient Star is one of the best watches I've ever seen when it comes to Lume. In fact, I think it's one of my three kings of Lume, whereas the Seiko is not. I honestly had a lot of high hopes for it, but it wound up being pretty disappointing. I mean, it's not even up to the same level as their entry-level divers. So in my comparison tests, it didn't even keep up with my Turtle or Monster. It basically has the same lume as a dress kayaks. So here we got an easy win for the Orient with a 10, and I'm going to give the Seiko a 3. Let's move on to usability, which is mostly about how easy these watches are to read. But I also factor in if there are any extra features that make it more useful. Again, I think this one is an easy one. The Seiko, as gorgeous and as beautiful as this dial is, doesn't have a ton of contrast. The polished silver and the white of the hands and the indices still come through clearly, but nowhere near to the extent of the Orient. The Orient has a wider and more expansive dial, which regardless of comfort, does allow things to be larger and easier to read. And here, not only is there a clear contrast in colors, but also textures, as the brushed hands and indices are a stark contrast to the deep dark sunburst dial. Now, by no means is the Glacier Marine Master hard to read. In fact, the dual textures on the hands help them to stand out in a variety of conditions. Yet, put these two watches right next to each other, and honestly it's like night and day. And that's even before you get to the fact that the Orient has that power reserve, which again, love it or hate it, is still an extra feature. So here, another easy win for Orient with a 10, while I give the Seiko a 7. Although, when it comes to the next category, versatility, it's a whole other story. Now, what I mean by versatility is just how many different situations or environments can you use that watch in. And this does depend on what type of watches you're looking at. Although, when you're talking about two really good divers, I think this is really going to come down to on whether or not you can use either of them as a dress watch in a pinch. The Orient, as eye-catching as it is also wider, thicker, and very much a casual tool watch. Don't get me wrong, my philosophy with watches is to wear whatever you like, whatever makes you happy, whenever or wherever you want. But I don't think the Orient here is as well suited to a suit as, say, the Glacier Seiko. The Seiko is still a tad chunky, but the gorgeous style and the eye-catching angles and polish of the case make it much more suitable in a dress situation, making it more of a dress diver, even though I know some people hate that term. Regardless, for versatility, I think the Seiko comes out ahead here, with 8 points to the Orient's 5. Next up, durability. And this one's kind of hard to judge, especially when you're talking about two watches that have almost identical specs. As we're talking about two 316L stainless ISO rated 200 meter divers with sapphire. So overall, they're pretty equal on that front. Now, if I want to get nitpicky, Orient might have an edge here thanks to its brushed finish, as that would at least help the watch stay looking better longer. But at the same time, the Glacier Marine Master has that Diashield coating, which is also applied to the bracelet and bezel. And perhaps that's the more important thing here. Overall, I think they're pretty equal here, but I think that Diashield coating does give the Seiko a slight advantage. So I'm going to say 8 for the Seiko and 7 for the Orient. Next up, we have the last of the abilities with wearability. And this is going to be pretty subjective to my 7¼ inch wrist. And with that in mind, I think this is an easy win for the Marine Master Reduced, as this is one of the most comfortable divers I've ever worn. Now, the Orient Star, in its own way, is very comfortable, and it actually wears smaller than the specs would suggest. The minimalist case shape minimizes that 43.5mm width, all while the curvy lugs combined with female end links reduces the overall effect of lug to lug to something that may be more like a 49 than a 51. Yet even with all that, the Orient Star is no match for the Marine Master, as its curvy case shape seems to conform perfectly to my wrist, making it feel honestly like the ideal 40mm diver, despite it actually being 42. So clear win to the Seiko with a score of 10 and a 7 for the Orient Star. We're not quite done yet, but we are getting close. But up next, let's talk about uniqueness. And I think this is another easy one. Now, the Glacier dial is something that clearly makes this Seiko special, but honestly, it's just about the only aspect of it. The fact that there's an entire Marine Master family literally means that a lot of this watch isn't unique. And even beyond that, I've seen other Seikos with similar bezels and handsets, specifically the 62 Moss being one of them. In some ways, this goes even deeper than that, as the watch that inspired this, that 1968 Diver, helped to define Seiko's design language for decades. So when you look at this one, it's very easy to see a lot of familiarity with many of the other Seikos out there. And while that may be a huge strength in other ways, uniqueness and originality isn't one of them. Now, the Save the Ocean dial here makes up for a lot of that, but not quite enough to beat that Orient. Yes, this is a Pepsi, but beyond that, have you ever seen anything exactly like it? I mean, the handset alone, I don't even know what to call it. Skeletonized batons, maybe? But regardless, that's a good sign that this is pretty unique. So here Orient gets another 10, while the Seiko gets a 7, mostly for that dial. Alright, so the last category here, and let's finally talk value. For the Orient Star Diver, it has an MSRP around 650 US, although if you do look around, you will find it closer to 500. Whereas with the Seiko Glacier Marine Master Reduced, it's got an MSRP of 1250. And if you shop around, you may find it closer to $1,000. Regardless, MSRP or street price, it's almost twice as much as that Orient Star. If you really want to get into the details, go check out the individual reviews of each watch. But the short version is that the Orient Star is punching way above its price point. And in a lot of ways, it is typical for them. Whereas with the Seiko, it's not completely beyond reason, but it's well on the high end for what you get. And again, that's typical with Seiko these days. So with that in mind, Orient comes out the winner in this category with an 8. Well, I'm going to give the Seiko a 4. So adding everything up, we see that the Glacier Marine Master comes in with a score of 86, while the Orient Star squeaks out a win with a 91. Proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Orient Star Diver is the better watch. Or is it? The thing is, the way I used to score these is completely different. Back in my previous comparison videos, rather than give an individual score to each watch in each category, I'd give the winner of that category a 1. And here, the Seiko won more categories. So if I was to add things up like I used to, the Seiko would win in a landslide 8-5. So what's my point? Why am I telling you this if there's no clear winner? Well, simply put, I just wanted to illustrate that not only is there some subjectivity when you're talking about individual categories, but how you score things can vastly change the outcomes here. Which is why I feel that the discussions that go along with all of these comparison videos is far more important than any final score. And this is also why I like to end these kinds of videos by saying that this is really the beginning of a much longer conversation than, say, the final word on anything. So if you got a different opinion, and if you were following along and came up with a completely different score and outcome, then let me know down below. Let's talk about it. For me, personally, I think the Seiko Marine Master Reduced is clearly a better watch than the Orient, but not by much. And it's certainly not enough to justify twice the price, as almost every category it won by a slim margin. When it really comes down to it, you can't really go wrong with either of these. Personally, I love them both in different ways, and personally they're both keepers. Neither of these are going anywhere. And I think either of them would really be a great watch to get. It really just depends on what you're looking for and what you're willing to spend. While the Orient Star is the clear winner when it comes to value, the Marine Master is the winner when it comes to comfort and maybe looks. Anyway, this has been a bit of a lengthy one, so I thank you for sticking with it, and I hope you enjoyed it. As usual, let me know what you think about either of these, as well as this comparison down below. Or let me know if you'd like to see either of these compared to any other watches out there. As always, you all know what to do down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. I'll see you next time.